Hi everybody, this is Professor Paul Hicks for another lecture in Philosophy 101. I hope everybody's being safe and everybody's happy out there. So today we're going to talk about philosophy of religion. And here's something that's going to be really important. I'm going to discuss with you certain arguments, and I'm going to give you premises and conclusions, and I'm hoping that you'll have a piece of paper or something with you to write these down. I want you to take notes as you're watching this video. All right, and this is important because when I talk about these arguments, I'm going to refer back to certain premises, and you're not going to remember what they are, just out of your sheer memory. So make sure you do take some notes. If you don't have some paper with you right now, pause the video, go get it, and take some notes. Okay. So philosophy of religion. We've talked a little bit about philosophy of religion. Remember, philosophy is concerned about testing claims, trying to understand what is actually true, what is the real nature of reality. We talked about God a little bit, and religion clearly has something to do with God. Philosophy of religion takes place, all branches of philosophy have a philosophy of religion. So there is, for example, a religious metaphysics that we're going to talk a little bit about today. That is the nature of God. There is religious epistemology. How can we come to understand that God exists? What is it to know God exists? When is it rational to believe God exists? There's also ethics, and we talked about that in the Euthyphro earlier this semester. Do we need God to actually be moral people or not? So philosophy of religion really encompasses a lot of different areas of philosophy, and it's a really rich area, and it's really worth studying. Whether you're an atheist or a theist, doesn't really matter. There's a real value, I believe, in philosophy of religion, and it's certainly one of my favorite areas of philosophy. So we're not going to talk about all areas of philosophy of religion. This is not a class where we have the time to do something like that. So I'm choosing some very particular areas to talk about in philosophy of religion. Number one, the central question that we have in philosophy of religion is, does God actually exist or not? Right? Because all the other claims don't matter if God doesn't actually exist. If we can't prove the existence of God, then all of the other religious claims are empty. Right? They don't have any force behind them. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about some of the very classical arguments for the existence of God. Philosophers for a long time have believed that in order to believe in God, one has to have reasons to believe in God. Now, this will be challenged in a couple of weeks when we talk about Alvin Plantinga, but for now, understand that it's always been important to have reasons to believe in God. You have some sort of evidence to believe in God. You have some sort of good reasoning to believe in God. And so we're going to talk about some of the main arguments that philosophers have given to the conclusion that God exists. So the first one I want to talk about is from Saint Anselm of Canterbury. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was an 11th century philosopher, so this is a long time ago. And he developed what we now understand to be the ontological argument. Now, there's many other ontological arguments. For example, we find one in Descartes' Meditations. We have contemporary philosophers like Alvin Plantinga, who has an ontological argument for the existence of God through what we call modal logic. We're not going to talk about that. We're just going to talk about the very simple ontological argument for the existence of God given to us by St. Anselm. Now, this is a really interesting argument because it's going to make an attempt to define God into existence. And this is rather odd because we're not really sure that you can define something into existence, right? Can you just make a definition and say that that thing must exist? That's going to be key to understanding this. So we can agree that we can define something out of existence. So, for example, if I said, do square circles exist? Well, a square-shaped circle is an impossibility. And so because of that contradiction, we understand with absolute certainty that square circles do not exist. So you can define something out of existence, but it would be a real interesting leap if we can actually define something into existence. So let's go ahead and determine this, whether St. Anselm was actually successful in his argument. So once again, this is the part where I need you to write this stuff down, okay? So let's go ahead and start with the very first premise of the argument. he says it is a conceptual truth. That is, it's true by definitions of the terms used, that God is a being than which none greater can be imagined. That is God is the concept, just the concept of God, right? Is that God is the greatest conceivable being. Now, even if you don't believe in God, a lot of atheists are going to agree that if God did exist, then God would be the greatest conceivable being. Some atheists, of course, are going to deny that, and we'll talk about that later. But God, conceptually speaking, is defined as a being which none greater can be conceived. So that's premise number one. Premise number two, God exists as an idea in the mind. That is, we have the concept of God in our mind. We know that whether God exists outside of us, maybe we don't know that yet, but we know that, I at least think that I know what a God would be if a God existed. And so I have the concept of God in the mind. That's premise number two. All right, premise number three. A being that exists as an idea in the mind, and a being that exists in reality, so that is, the being exists both in the mind and in reality, with all other things being equal, is greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. All right? So, in order to understand this, think of it this way. Right? We know God exists as an idea in the mind. Right? Everybody has some sort of concept of God. Whether or not you think they exist or not, doesn't matter. You have a concept of God. And now here's what Anselm was trying to do, and this might be the tricky part to his argument, that would it be greater if God existed only as an idea in the mind, or would it be greater if God existed both as an idea in the mind and in reality? According to Anselm, something that exists in reality is greater than something that exists only as a mental content, right? As some sort of mental image or some sort of thought. So he says, a being that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is, other things being equal, greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. All right. Well, if these things are true, if these premises are true, what follows from this? Well, if God exists only as an idea in the mind, then we can imagine something that is greater than God. That is a being which is really great in the mind, but also really great in reality. Right? But remember what we said here. God is the greatest conceivable being. There is no other being that can be as great as God. So if God is the greatest conceivable being, and God exists in the mind, which premise 2 says he does, and it would be great that if God existed both in the mind and in reality, as premise 3 suggests, then there cannot exist anything greater than the greatest conceivable being. That's simply true by understanding what greater conceivable being means. Here's the thing, you cannot imagine anything greater than the greatest conceivable being. Therefore, you cannot imagine something greater than God, and therefore God must exist not just in the mind, but God must exist in reality as well. So there's an argument for the existence of God. Let's talk about some of the popular objections to it. Are we able to say that Anselm was really, with absolute proof as he thinks he has he defined him into existence? Well, there was a contemporary to Anselm, a monk who believed in God, was a Christian as well, by the name of Gneo. Now, Gneo worried that Anselm was making an irrational move to go from the existence of an idea to the existence of a thing. That is, Anselm said, look, you're just defining God into existence. And so he gives an example of this that we'll call the Pyland. That is what he calls the perfect island. Right? So the Pyland. It is a conceptual truth that a Pyland is an island which none greater can be imagined. That is, it is the greatest possible island. Can you imagine the greatest possible island? We think you can. All right. Second, it is, a Pyland exists as an idea in the mind. Also, a Pyland exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is greater than a Pyland that exists only as an idea in the mind. Thus, Ganillo says, if a pyland exists only as an idea in the mind, then we can imagine an island that is greater than a pyland, that is the greatest possible island. And therefore, we have to give up that the greatest possible island that is conceptual actually exists. This is, of course, going to be a problem. You notice we have the same form as Anselm did with his ontological argument. So, just because we assert a certain definition does not mean we can define, does not mean that that thing must exist. And this is the problem that Ganillo is really pulling up. There are some other objections to Anselm. Thomas Aquinas, who we'll get to in just a bit with another argument for the existence of God. He was Saint Thomas Aquinas. He clearly believed in God. He believed that the existence of God he thought was self-evident. But he gave some arguments against Anselm and said that Anselm argument didn't work. One, not everybody defines God as the greatest conceivable being. And so here's a rejection of the first premise. There's some people that have a very different view of God. This is just a fact. Some people see God as being this very petty individual, always out to get people. Some people see God as this great, wonderful being that is perfect in morality. Right? There's all kinds of different definitions of God. And since not everybody defines God as the greatest conceivable being, it was not going to be a conceptual truth that God is the greatest conceivable being. Even though Aquinas would certainly think he is the greatest conceivable being. All right. So you're kind of assuming that everybody shares the same concept of God and you're only talking about the same concept of God. Well, look, here's another problem. Let's say even if we assume that everyone shares the same concept of God as a being which none greater can be conceived, so God really is a greatest conceivable being, it doesn't therefore follow that you understand that the word signifies exists, actually, but only that it exists mentally. So even if I'm going to accept that we all agree that God is the greatest conceivable being, is it possible for me to think that God exists only in the mind and not in reality? Aquinas thinks that it is, and if it is, then there's a problem for Anselm, right? There's a real problem for Anselm because it's not conceptually true. That is, you can hold the concept of God and also hold the concept God does not exist, and it doesn't seem to be a contradiction, where Anselm is suggesting that it in fact is a contradiction. All right. So there's another objection to Anselm that's pretty popular, and this is from the philosopher Immanuel Kant. He was an 18th century philosopher, very famous modern philosopher, and his objection goes after the third premise of the ontological argument. That is, a being that exists in the mind and in reality is greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. According to premise 3, existence is what is known as some sort of great-making property, as the matter is sometimes put, it's some sort of perfection. So premise 3 entails, 1, existence is a property. That to exist is to say something about you. And that 2, instantiating existence makes a thing better, all other things being equal, than it would have been otherwise. Kant wants to reject premise number 3 on the ground, just as a purely formal matter, that existence does not function as some sort of predicate. So for example, if I was to say my car is red, what we're doing is that the car is the subject and red is the predicate, and you are predicating red onto the car. But to say God exists, is that to give a predicate about what God is? Does that tell me anything about God? Or does that just say that God is? Right? Existence doesn't tell us about a thing, he says. It just tells us that it is. And this is a problem for Kant. All right? All right, so now that we're done talking about the ontological argument, I want to move into another argument that is typically called the cosmological argument. And this is what we often call the first cause argument. Right? It seems that everything that exists must have been caused in some sort of way. So let me go ahead and lay this argument out. This argument is really brought to us by Thomas Aquinas, so we were talking about him with Anselm when he objects to Anselm. And Aquinas actually gives several arguments for the existence of God. This is just really one of them that I'm going to talk about today. Certainly the most famous one. All right, so go ahead and write this down. Premise number one, many things have come into existence. Okay, well that seems to be true. That doesn't seem to be very controversial. Two, every event has a cause. So everything is an effect, and it must have been caused by something, right? Everything that exists does so as a result of some series of causes. That's premise number three, right? So let me repeat premise three. Everything that exists does so as a result of some series of causes. So cause and effect. So for example, my existence, I am an effect of my mom and dad having sex, right? And you know, I know you don't want to think about that kind of stuff, but I exist. My parents were my cause. Well, notice that my parents were my cause, but they were also an effect as well. That they were caused by something. Specifically, they were caused by my grandparents. Now, of course, my grandparents, who caused my parents, were actually caused themselves. They were an effect. They were caused by my great-grandparents, and so on and so on and so on. Now, look, we can't go on back infinitely. There had to have been some sort of first cause. At least that's what Aquinas is suggesting, right, in his premise number four. He says, no series of causes can go back to infinity. Now, why would we hold this? Can you imagine any possibility of something going back to infinity? Right, so that there would be cause and effect, 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 and it just keeps going ad infinitum. But that's not something we can really put our mind around, and we tend to think that that's an impossibility, and so we reject the infinite. Therefore, since cause and effect cannot be infinite, premise number five is this: there must be some first cause. Well, what do we define as the first cause? God. God is defined as the first cause. And if God is defined as the first cause, and we can establish that there must have been a first cause, we have now established the existence of God. All right. So there's the basic structure of the cosmological argument. What are some problems with this particular position? Well, one, why do we assume that no series of causes can be infinite? All right, let's go back to that. So go back to premise number four, which says no series of causes can go back infinitely. Okay, let's hold that to be true. Why do we hold that to be true? Well, we believe that to be true because we can't wrap our mind around the infinite. It just seems too far out there to believe that there is some sort of effect without a cause. It doesn't make any sort of sense. Well, if that's true, and we want to reject anything which has an infinite regress, then what about God? Is God infinite? If there can be no infinite, then God cannot be infinite itself. And here we have the theist having a bit of a problem. Because on one hand, they want to say nothing can be infinite, but on the other hand, they want to say God is infinite. Well, look, you can't have it both ways. Either nothing is infinite, and therefore God is not infinite, or things can be infinite, therefore God is infinite. Well, if things can be infinite, then there's no reason that cause and effect can't go back infinitely. Right? So maybe we just don't need any sort of concept of God like that. Okay, let's say that another problem here for the cosmological argument. Why does the first cause have to be God? Right? I mean, couldn't we have defined anything as being the first cause? I could have defined Paul Bunyan as being the first cause. I could have defined a leprechaun as being the first cause. There's all sorts of things I could define as being the first cause. Does the cosmological argument therefore prove that the leprechaun that really caused us, or something like that? Not really. Another problem with the cosmological argument is everything needs a cause, right? That everything's an effect, and by definition, an effect has a cause, and everything has a cause. Well, if that's true, what caused God? Where'd God come from? Here, Aquinas actually says God is what he calls a necessary being. That is something that has to exist, that must exist out of necessity. But it's not very self-evident that that is true. I mean, clearly we have lots of people who don't believe in God. Are they all just foolish, as Anselm wants to suggest that they are? So we do have some sort of problem. What caused God? Was there a mommy God and a daddy God? And then, of course, you just pushed a question back one. What caused those gods? Right? At some point, there has to exist something, right? By this own argument, there has to exist something that has always existed. Why does it have to be God? Couldn't it just be space and time? Couldn't it just be matter? Isn't that possible? I mean, there's no reason to think that God happens to be it. Also, another problem with this particular argument, it doesn't get us towards, say, the Christian God, the Judeo-Christian God that Aquinas is arguing for. Isn't it possible that the deists are right? So the deist, as compared to a deist believes God existed, created everything, and really just left us alone. Where a theist actually believes that God exists and that God is supposed to have a personal relationship with you, and somebody you worship, and somebody you praise, and somebody you pray to, right? Deists don't believe in that. They just think that, there was a great mind that got everything together, but it's not something you worship, not something you pray to, or anything like that. So the cosmological argument at best does not prove theism. It only proves deism at best. And also, why, if it doesn't have to be just deism, I mean, it could be any number of gods. I mean, how many gods have people believed in, right? Okay, so another problem that the cosmological argument has to do with the concept of causation. Notice that the entire argument rests on the concept of causation, that is, one event causing another event. So let's try to talk a little bit about what causation is and why this is a problem for Aquinas in the cosmological argument. All right, so let's think about causation. Causation is not something we experience, and this is a problem because a lot of you believe that knowledge comes out of experience and understanding comes out of experience. Well, did you ever experience causation? I don't think you have. And let me explain that, if I can, by an analogy of ethics. So imagine for a moment that there is a group of, say, teenage boys, and they're throwing lighter fluid and matches into a box. Now you walk over there and you notice that in the box are live kittens, and that what these boys are really doing are burning live kittens. Now, immediately you have the impression that that is wrong. I hope you do, at least. Okay, so here's the thing. Did you experience wrongness? Did you really experience wrongness? I know that many of you are saying right now, of course you experienced something wrong. But let me ask you this. What did the wrongness look like? Did you see wrongness? What shape was it? What color was wrongness? Did you truly experience it? Or did you simply experience the event and you have in your own mind certain beliefs about what is right and what is wrong? And so you sort of projected wrongness from your mind out into the world. You have a certain ethical belief for burning kittens is wrong. Maybe it's because you think it harms kittens or something like this, but you have a belief that burning kittens is wrong. So you projected from your mind a theory onto the world that the particular action you see was wrong. You did not experience wrongness. Well, here's the thing. You might be doing the same thing with causation. You don't experience causation. You don't experience causation at all. All you're seeing is that one event follows from another event. And when you see one event following from another event many times, you get what David Hume calls a necessary connection between these two events. That is, you just say one event causes another event. But you don't know it. You don't have any sort of real experience with it. All right, now that may seem a little far-fetched that causation doesn't exist, but remember, if going back with the rationalists and the empiricists, if the empiricists are right, and all knowledge derives from senses and derives out of experience, and if you don't have any experience of causation, then you don't know anything about causation. Okay, let's just say that causation really does exist, and we've just been wrong, that David Hume was wrong, and clearly causation exists. Well, there's a problem. What kind of causation exists? How do we know causation exists? Let me give you an example. Let's say I'm shooting pool, and I hit the cue ball. The cue ball moves across the billiards table, hits the 8-ball, and the 8-ball moves. Did the cue ball cause the 8-ball to move or not? Did the cue ball cause the 8-ball to move? The simple answer that we have is yes, that when I hit the cue ball ran into the 8-ball and the 8-ball moved. Let's really break down for just a moment what you experienced. You saw the movement of the cue ball, that is mine moving the cue ball, and you saw the cue ball hit the 8-ball, and then you saw the 8-ball move after that. Correct? That's all you saw. You brought causation into this picture because you believed in causation. You didn't actually experience it yourself. But here's another thing about causation. Notice what is absolutely necessary to any belief about causation here. In order for the cue ball to have hit the 8-ball and the 8-ball to move, in order for us to say the cue ball caused the 8-ball to move, what we have to say is that the cue ball was in space next to the 8-ball. That is, the cue ball was in space next to the 8-ball, meaning that the cue ball was next to the 8-ball. Right? The cue ball had to touch the 8-ball in order for the 8-ball to move. So it seems then that space in and of itself is a requirement or a necessary condition for causation. In addition, time is a necessary condition for causation. So for example, if event A, that is the movement of the cue ball, caused event B, that is the movement of the 8-ball, if event A really caused event B, then event A must have occurred prior to event B, correct? So once again, event A here is the cue ball moving, event B is the 8-ball moving. In order for us to say the cue ball caused the 8-ball to move, the movement of the cue ball must have come in time prior to the movement of the 8-ball. It wouldn't make any sense for us to say, though the 8-ball was moving prior to the movement of the cue ball, and therefore the movement of the 8-ball was caused by the movement of the cue ball. That doesn't make any sense. So notice what we have here. You have what we're going to call natural causation. Space and time are required. Any experience that we have with causation has always required space and time. Now, why is this important? Well, because the cosmological argument is saying that if you have experience with natural causation, which an argument can certainly be given that we do, then therefore you have experience with supernatural causation. And Hume wants to draw a line here and say that we can't go there. Just because we know or believe in space and time causation, that doesn't give us any sort of experience with supernatural causation. We have no experience with that, and therefore we can't require it. We don't know. It could happen, maybe, but we don't get that out of our experience, and any concept of causation that we have cannot take into account supernatural causation. And so supernatural causation is just this baffling concept that we need to get rid of. All right, so those are the cosmological argument, the main cosmological argument for the existence of God. All right, now I want to get into the design argument. Okay, one moment. Okay, so the third argument for the existence of God is what we'll call the design argument, often referred to as the teleological argument. Telos is just some purpose that has some sort of end. Well, the argument for design essentially says that the universe looks and appears to be designed. right? And then if that's the case, there must have been some sort of designer or somebody that gave a purpose to the universe itself. So let's go ahead and break down the design argument if we can. The material universe. Here's premise number one. I want you to write this down. All right. Premise number one. The material universe resembles the intelligent productions of human beings in that it exhibits design. All right. Premise number two. The design in any human artifact is the effect of having been made by an intelligent being. Premise number three. Like effects have like causes. All right, now let's assume all three of those premises are true. What is derived or deduced from that is the conclusion, and this is statement number 4. Therefore, the design in the material universe is the effect of having been made by an intelligent creator. All right. Does the universe really appear to be designed or not? That's going to be something we're going to have to deal with here, right? Well, we'll deal with that in just a bit. Let me give you a better, what I think is a better argument or a better understanding of this. And this is going to come from the biologist by the name of William Paley. And this is what we call the watchmaker analogy. And he says this: imagine that you come from a society that doesn't tell time. You have no concept of 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. You have no clocks. You have no watches. Nothing of that sort. All right. Imagine you come from that kind of society. Okay. Now, if you're walking along a beach and say maybe you stumble across a rock, you notice that that rock really looks a lot like the other stuff on the beach, right? I mean, it's just sand just looks like broken rock. There's other rocks on the beach. As far as you know, that rock has always been there. All right, but now let's say you walk a little further along down the beach and you see a pocket watch. All right, now you look at the watch. Can you tell just by looking at the watch that the watch was designed? That is, the watch has some sort of purpose. And if so, what is it about the watch that gives it that gives us the idea that somebody designed it or gave some sort of purpose? Remember, you don't know anything about keeping time or anything of that sort. Well, all right. Paley argues that if you look at the watch and you notice that it has a bunch of small little parts, and that each of those little parts have a very particular function, and that if any one of those little parts ceased to function in just a very precise way that it does, then the whole thing would break. And so there must have been some sort of intelligent being which puts this together. Whatever purpose it is, we may not know, but the fact is somebody did this, and it has some sort of purpose to them. All right, now Paley says, let's take a look at the human body. I mean, we can extrapolate this and other teleological arguments to the entire universe, but let's stay with Paley for right now and look at the human body. The human body has all sorts of different parts that all have a particular function. So, for example, the function of my heart, right? My heart is there to beat and to pump blood. If it ceases to pump blood, what happens? I die, right? You have go into cardiac failure and you die. Kidneys have a function to filter, right, impurities. The brain has a function. Your tongue has a function, right? Every part of your body has some sort of function. The liver has a function. I think it's supposed to filter alcohol, right? Everything is supposed to function in a very particular way. And when everything does function in that particular way, you exist, right? Well, according to Paley, then God created you. That you are the product of design. That everything had to fit just the precise way in order for it to be here, right? To actually exist, to actually work. Just like the pocket watch has all of these small parts and therefore has a designer and has some sort of purpose. The same is true with us, right? It seems that everything looks that we were designed. Okay, well, what are some problems with this type of argument, this type of design argument? First of all, I want to say there's all kinds of design arguments. This is just probably the most famous one that I'm giving you. What's some problems with this? Number one, we may not be the product of design. That is, there's this theory now we call evolution. And evolution seems to answer all of these questions for us without any necessary connection to design whatsoever. That is, why is it that we exist the way that we do? Why is it that we have these small parts that function in the way they do? We don't need to reach out to God in order to understand that to be true. We just reach out to evolution did this, and we are just a product of evolution. Okay, here's the thing about that, right? You have to deny evolution to some extent, at least the evolution that we as a species evolved other species. Think about this for a moment, right? Let's see, are we more of a product of evolution or design? If look at our body. Do our bodies work perfectly? Or do they break down a lot? Right? They seem to break down a lot. That's why you go to a doctor, right? So there's a problem there. Also, the watch doesn't seem to have extra parts to it. You find out, though, the human body does have extra parts. That is, it has parts that you can get rid of and you'll live just fine. For example, the appendix. It seems possible to get rid of the appendix and you can live just fine. Now, why do we have an appendix? Well, the evolutionists can answer that question. But if you're coming from a design argument that God created us in the way that you see us today, why did he create us with an appendix or something we don't need? It doesn't seem to be very godly to do something like that. All right, 1 second. All right, excuse me. Here's another question, and I want you to think about this carefully. Why do men have nipples? I know that. Why do you think that? Just think about this for a minute. Why do men have nipples? Imagine God created me in the way that we see today. Why do I have nipples? They seem to be completely pointless. We can understand why women have nipples, but why do men have nipples? That doesn't make any sense. I can understand this from an evolutionary standpoint. There is good understanding of, if we take evolution as a theory, it can explain to us that nipples are a holdover. But design can't seem to do it. Now maybe God, just put nipples on men because they're kind of decorative or something like that. Those are possibilities, but do you really have to buy into that? Do you really believe that? What is the purpose of nipples on men? Why do we have them? They don't seem to have any sort of purpose at all. So that's not going to work. So also, let's just say, are we really a product of design? Would an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God design the human body in the way you see it today? So for example, can you think of a better way for the body to be? You may have heard of an astrophysicist by the name of Neil deGrasse Tyson, and he gave this response to the watchmaker analogy. He says, if you think about all the ways the human body can be created, it seems to be that there is a flaw in the way that it was created. That is, we drink water, for example, and breathe out of the same hole. So here's my water here for just a moment, right? I breathe out of this hole, I speak out of this hole, and I drink out of it, right? Okay, well, what does that tend to lead to? Choking. Why do we do that? If you're really smart and you really wanted to create the human body in a way that was smart, why don't we put like a hole on the side of our neck and then we drink water through the hole on our side of our neck and we breathe out of this one? Wouldn't that be smarter? Do we really look to be designed? The atheist is typically going to say, no, we don't. Okay. We'll come back to this. Bertrand Russell will kind of refer to it in the video for next week, so I'm going to go ahead and hold off on that for now. But once again, that's the teleological argument. There's an argument from design. There's a lot of arguments against it. Now, keep in mind, there are still people that hold all of the arguments we're talking about. and they do have answers for it. So I encourage you to do a little more research into all of these arguments. My goal here is just to explain what the argument is and to give you some basic objections on some of the problems that have come about from that argument. All right, so I want to get into our last argument now. Now, these other arguments have been making some sort of claim for the existence of God. This argument here that I'm going to talk about now is what we call Pascal's wager. It comes from Blaise Pascal. He was a French mathematician. His dates are 1623 to 1662, so a 17th century thinker. And he has what we call a wager, the Pascal's wager. That is, we should hedge our bet that God exists because we'll be better off if we do. So let's go ahead and break down this argument here. So go ahead and write these premises down. Premise number one, either God exists or God does not exist. The answer here, the odds for God's existence are at best 50-50. Premise number two, if God does not exist and we believe that he did, we don't lose anything. At least we don't lose much. Right? We're just wrong. If God does not exist and we actually didn't believe, we don't really gain much. I mean, we find out maybe that we were right the entire time, and that makes us kind of happy, but we don't really gain anything. Okay, let's say now God does exist. So let's say God does exist and you spent your lifetime believing that God exists. What does Christian theology tell us is going to happen? We go to heaven. We gain eternal happiness. Okay, now let's go to premise number 5. If God exists and we did not believe, what's going to happen? Right? So if I'm an atheist, what's going to happen to me after I die if I didn't praise God and love God and worship God? You go to hell, right? You suffer eternal damnation. And Pascal says, look, if you don't lose much for believing in God and being wrong, but you will lose an awful lot if God does exist and you're wrong. Now, if you just happen to believe God did exist, if you're wrong about that, you don't lose anything. But if you believe God exists and you're right about it, you gain everything. And so for Pascal, all you do is hedge a bet. Just believe. Just choose to believe by sheer force of will yourself to believe that God exists, because in doing so, you will not lose much, but you have the opportunity to gain everything. So it's kind of like a lottery system in the sense that, I can play the lottery and I can spend $1. I don't lose much. $1's not that big of a deal to me. But imagine if I win. That's a big deal now, right? I win $100 million or something like that. All right. So what's the problem with this type of argument? The what if you're wrong argument. Well, here's the problem. Let's take a look at premise number 1. Premise number 1 says that either God exists or God does not exist, and it assumes that the odds are really 50-50. Why would we assume that? Is it really the probability 50-50? Right? Because odds have to do with probability. So let's think about the probabilities of all the gods existing. How many gods have people believed in over the years? I mean, tens of thousands of gods, right? Not just the Judeo-Christian God, but what about Amun-Ra? What about Thor? What about, Zeus? Or, any number of gods that people have believed in. If you really were to say that there's an equal chance of God's existence as not, well, there has to be an equal chance of all of their existing, doesn't it? So, why do we only choose the Judeo-Christian God? If we really want to be statistical about this, we have to include in all of the possible gods. So, for example, let's just say that there's 10,000 gods that people have believed in. That was a possibility. There's probably far more than that, but that's a lot of gods. Let's just say then, if those are the number of possibilities for gods, then choosing one of those gods, the odds of one of those gods existing is 1 out of 10,000. The odds that that one god does not exist are 9,999 out of 10,000. What's more likely now? Right? Another problem with Pascal's wager is, do you really control your beliefs? Right? Do you really control what you actually believe? Is believing in God just a matter of choice? So, for example, this is a blue shirt. I want you right now to just believe that it's a pink shirt. By sheer force of will, change your belief that it's a pink shirt. Now, here's the thing. You can imagine it being a pink shirt, but that's not the same as really, truly believing that it's a pink shirt. Why do I say this? Well, it doesn't really appear to me that you have a choice over your beliefs. Right? There's a lot of influences for why you believe whatever you believe. A lot of it say your upbringing, you were raised a certain way, you view the world in a certain way. And so certain truths must exist. But you don't really control your beliefs. If you think you can, let's go ahead and say this. For everybody out there right now that believes in God, I want you, by your pure just sheer force of will, make a decision not to believe in God right now. Just choose to do it at the snap of my fingers. And for everybody out there that's an atheist who does not believe in God, just by sheer force of will, choose to believe in God. Can you do it? I don't think you can. I don't think your belief in God comes down to a matter of choice. So we have a problem. We have a problem. If you cannot control your beliefs, then Pascal's wager doesn't make sense. I can't choose to believe in God. Now, Pascal actually had an answer to this. I'm not sure I really like his answer to this, but it essentially says this. You have to kind of fake it until you make it. He says that if you're having problems believing in God, he says you need to, in his words, deaden your rational senses. All right? His words, deaden your rational senses. Stop being so rational. Stop trying to be a rational person. He says, go to a monastery and stay there for a while. Only associate with people who believe as you believe, or as you want to believe. Never associate with atheists. Only read books by people who believe in God, and never read books by atheists. And eventually, he says, you'll come to believe. And that by doing that, you are making that choice. I'm not sure I want to do that. I think that's a problem as a philosopher, to deaden my rational senses. So, yeah, that's problematic. The other problem, and why I don't think this argument really holds a lot of sway to people that don't believe, is this argument is based upon the idea of heaven and hell. If I don't believe in God, what's the chances I believe in heaven and hell? Right? So the odds aren't going to be 50-50 that there's a heaven or hell. We don't believe in, right? If you don't believe in God, you don't believe in heaven or hell. And so that's not going to be a real powerful motivator to get you to believe in God. All right, so those are the main arguments that philosophers have given for the existence of God. The ontological argument by Anselm, the cosmological argument by Aquinas, Pascal's wager, and the design or teleological arguments. So think about those arguments. Next week we'll talk about atheism. We'll give some sort of arguments for why people will say that God does not believe. I'm sorry, that belief in God is not rational. And then we'll consider those. All right. I hope you all have a good week. See you in the next week.